While Reaper Man set the tone for the golden era of Discworld, Witches Abroad established the rules and layout of the new world Terry Pratchett had developed with moving pictures. And, like his first foray into world building, Pratchett took to establishing this world through the eyes of tourists. Is this a more enjoyable trip than Rincewind and Two Flowers, though? Well, let's see. What is Witches Abroad? Following the death of fairy godmother Desiderata Hollow, Margaret Garlick has come to inherit the witch's magic wand, alongside instructions to make sure that a young woman named Emberella does not marry the charming Duke of Genua. So, to make sure Desiderata's last wishes are granted, and eager to fulfill her duties as a fairy godmother, Margaret decides to go to Genua. However, despite her desire to make this trip alone, Margaret cannot stop Granny Witherwax and Nanny Ogg from tagging along. Can the Lonker witches make it to Genua in time to stop the wedding? Well, first they'll have to deal with that savage wilderness known as foreign parts. How does the world of Witches Abroad work? Like I said, Witches Abroad lays out the rules of the disc that will stay more or less consistent for the rest of the series. And yet, most of its world building concerns just that, rules and conventions rather than places or people. There are the occasional physical aspects of the disc that are established here, such as the character of Casanunda or the land that will become Uberwald, but other aspects like the city of Genua don't really appear after this story. Jamo Casanunda is the world's second greatest lover, as well as being an accomplished swordsman, horseman, and highwayman, although he is not quite a man per se since he is in fact a dwarf. As you might expect, he hits it off with Nanny quite swimmingly, and they remain on-again, off-again lovers for the rest of the series. Uberwald, while it is not given that name here, is set up in this book as the collection of vaguely Germano-Slavic stereotypes and Hammer horror tributes that Pratchett will lovingly return to throughout the series. While it is a parody, it's an affectionate one, and I can see why Uberwald is the trope namer for any spooky, vaguely Eastern European land in a fictional work. This is also the book to establish Discworld's unique manifestation of racism. See, because there are a whole host of different fantasy races living on the disc, human-based segregation does not exist. To quote the book, racism was not a problem on the Discworld because, what with trolls and dwarves and so on, speciesism was more interesting. Black and white lived in perfect harmony and ganged up on green. While Pratchett will explore this speciesism further in future books, for now this comes into play with Emberella, who, despite being biracial, isn't regarded as unusual or odd by any of the other characters. Since Genua is partially based off New Orleans and features like voodoo and Creole cuisine are brought up, Pratchett does run dangerously close to whitewashing the very real racial conflict that brought these about in our world, but I think he manages to sidestep this issue by shifting its source to broad general poverty, instead of race-based slavery. Discworld may not have racism in it, but it still definitely has haves and have-nots. And even without slaves, someone needs to sweep the floors and till the fields while living in abject poverty. So, while I would classify this as a your mileage may vary aspect of the book that bears bringing up, I did personally enjoy it, and have no problem with it. Something I did have more trouble with enjoying, though, was the character of Granny Weatherwax. Many people regard this book as the point where her characterization finalized into the witch we all know and love, but personally, I think she still had a few kinks to iron out. See, this is the first book where Granny does this thing where she goes on and on, "Now, I'm not full of shit. No one could say that I'm full of shit. You know me, I'd be the first to admit if I was full of shit, but I'm not at all full of shit," and all while spewing shit everywhere. Then Nanny will quietly nod along while Margaret calls Granny out on her shit, and then Granny will refuse to give an inch, and then Margaret will storm off in a huff, and then Nanny will go to Margaret and calmly explain why Granny was actually in the right all along. This is meant to convey that Granny is a rude, obstinate, but ultimately decent person with everyone's best interests at heart, while Margaret is an idealistic, well-meaning, but ultimately naive person who doesn't fully understand things. And in later books I think this works well, but while reading Witches Abroad, my sympathies were often entirely with Margaret. It's not easy to make us sympathize or even admire a surly, unpleasant misanthrope because the character is, by definition, difficult to get along with. And while I think Pratchett succeeds in that eventually, In this book, he doesn't always stick the landing. The final, most important world-building attribute of Witches Abroad comes from its establishment of narrativium, Discworld's equivalent of quantum. Rather than being run by physics or science, the universe of Discworld operates under the principle of narrative causality, i.e., things happen a certain way because that's how stories work. And it's through this that Discworld lays out its new purpose. Instead of bringing up common stories and tropes to poke fun at them, like in earlier books, now Pratchett is concerned with bringing up stories and tropes to examine their origin and purpose. While funnier versions of fairy tales do show up throughout Witches Abroad, their main thematic function is to examine the question of why we tell such tales in the first place, which leads to the question, what does Witches Abroad have to say? Witches Abroad is an examination of fairy tales, and fairy tales tend to follow a certain pattern. There is an ordinary protagonist thrust into a magical situation, and through cleverness and the aid of kindly figures, they obtain a happy ending. There are, of course, variations. The Arne Thompson Uther Index numbers about 2,000 after all, but even with these variations, fairy tales tend to follow these rules. Real life is a bit different, though. Very few people run into magical situations, and any successful couple will tell you that happily ever afters are never easy, requiring constant maintenance and work. However, the main appeal of fairy tales is largely in how they distill basic human desires into a fun, magical story. Maybe Prince Charming doesn't exist, but many people long for one in their own lives. Maybe obtaining fame and fortune solely through hard work is a pipe dream, but it's a dream shared by lots of people. And maybe happy endings aren't real, but God, if we don't all want one. The concept of a fairy godmother, then, is an interesting one because it entails someone with the power to make these desires manifest. Like I said, the fairy tale protagonist is often aided by kindly figures, and when Magrat first gets her new fairy godmother wand, she is elated at the prospect of being able to make the dreams of young girls come true. While her first assignment might be a bit contrary to what she expected, she's still excited because who wouldn't want to be in such a position? Well, to name just one person, Granny Weatherwax, who is there to make sure that Magrat doesn't get any pesky ideas or confidence or anything. See, while Magrat is enamored with the idea of fairy godmothering, Granny is suspicious because it sounds an awful lot like meddling, something Granny does not abide. And throughout the rest of the book, Granny's suspicions are justified. As the longer witches run into variants of classic fairy tales, while Magrat wants to fix things with magic, Granny chooses more practical solutions, because one thing magic can't change is people. This all comes to a head when it turns out that the reason Desiderata was so set on protecting Emberella is because another fairy godmother by the name of Lilith has slowly gone about fixing Genua, to make it more in line with fairy tales. Everyone must be shiny, happy, and content with their lives on pain of re-education or execution, because that's how stories ought to go. And if Lilith sniffs out the slightest deviation from this tidy setup, she removes it permanently. The way Lilith sees it, Emberella must marry the Duke, because that's what poor young girls do in fairy tales. What Emberella, or anyone in Genua, thinks or feels is irrelevant, because Lilith knows what's best for them. The thing is, while Lilith is pretty obviously evil to us readers, and everyone in Genua is miserable even if they dare not show it, the thing that sustains Lilith and fuels her crusade against unconventionality is that she is convinced she is doing the right thing. After all, she's a fairy godmother. She has to be good. Have you ever heard of a fairy godmother who wasn't good? That's precisely what makes Lilith so evil, and Granny so suspicious of fairy godmothering. The fact that it not only involves the power to make desires manifest, but the axiomatic understanding that these desires are intrinsically good. Lilith is oblivious to the idea of her being even remotely bad because she does what she does in the name of progress. Granny will have none of it, though. But progress, Magrat began. Don't you talk to me about progress! Progress just means bad things happen faster! See, the thing is, we like to think that objectively evil acts like genocide, or slavery, or thought policing come from subjectively evil desires. A guy like Mussolini had to know he was evil, and the people who supported him had to be evil themselves. Right, Damon? There's no way anyone in Italy today would look at the father of fascism and think he wasn't so bad, because fascism is so obviously evil, and only evil people support such evil ideologies. Everyone knows you can't convince good people to do evil things, right? Except, you can. You can very easily do that, because all you really need to do is convince them that these evil things are good things. Look at any modern-day fascist and they'll tell you that they don't hate anyone. They just want to protect the future of their nation, the sanctity of their race, and the wombs of their women. They're the real victims, they'll swear. And even if you can tell that this isn't true, the fact is they believe it to be true. And that's all you need. While I don't think Pratchett fully succeeds in getting us to sympathize with Granny over Magrat in this book, I do think he succeeds in presenting Granny as the more enlightened choice in the basic philosophical debate between the two witches. While Magrat would never do anything as evil as Lilith, she does show a willingness to go along a similar path. And indeed, it's Lilith's obvious evil that partially convinces Magrat she'd do a better job at fixing things. To Granny and Terry Pratchett, though, it's precisely that sort of mindset. The assurance of one's moral righteousness and predecessors' moral failures that leads to the cycle of evil being repeated over and over again. No one has the right to force the world to fit the rules of fairy tales, because everyone's story is different, and real life does not fit the neat, tidy pattern of the Arne Thompson Uther Index. Every ideal and revolution has been twisted and appropriated by the same selfish impulse of humankind, until whatever higher goals it started out with become nothing but empty platitudes justifying and sustaining evil acts. In the end, revolutionary ideologies are rather like fairy tales. And when not everyone supports the revolution, sooner or later, like Lilith, revolutionary leaders set about fixing these deviants from their new society. So, what do you do? Well, in this book at least, Pratchett doesn't seem to have an answer. Granny doesn't have a solution to the cycle beyond simply disengaging from it, which is really why I don't fully sympathize with her here. Magrat's idealism may be misplaced, but she at least has a genuine desire to help people and make the world better. So what do? The answer will have to wait until the next book. Final verdict. Witches Abroad aims higher than any other Discworld novel before it. And while it doesn't always hit the mark, its troughs are still higher than any of the Color of Magic's peaks. It's because of this that I would give Witches Abroad a 9 out of 10. Because even if there are some niggling quibbles I have with it, the overall product is yet another masterpiece of the Golden Era. So for now, I'm Marco Keane, signing off, and I hope you liked this video. If you did, and you'd like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, share my video via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or other means, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you all, and I will see you in the next one.